Jessica Riedl is an economist who regularly publishes in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and many other periodicals. And she's cited literally hundreds of times a year in the national press. Washington Magazine listed her as one of the most influential policy observers in 2022. And she was named again in 2023, and she was named again in 2024. She's a true heavy in the small cadre of what anyone would consider serious governmental analysts in Washington, D.C., which has plenty of folks who don't quite qualify as serious analysts. Um, Jessica Riedl, welcome to the political conversation.
I'm glad to be here, Wally. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Before we get into a discussion of your most recent work, I would like your audience to understand your credentials as a serious conservative policy intellectual. Would you mind giving us a sketch of your career?
Sure, I grew up in Wisconsin, went to the University of Wisconsin for my bachelor's, Princeton for my master's degree. Then I spent a decade as the lead budget research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where I got in trouble a lot for beating up President Bush on his big budget deficits. After a decade at Heritage, I went over to the Senate and was chief economist to U.S. Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, and I was the staff director of the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Growth. After 6 years working in the Senate, I moved over to the Manhattan Institute, where I'm doing budget nerdery there for the last 8 years. In addition, I have worked on several presidential campaigns. I was director of budget and tax policy for the Rubio presidential campaign in 2016. And in 2012, I was the lead drafter of Mitt Romney's 10-year deficit reduction plan. And I would argue that I was not the reason both of them lost.
I agree.
I hope not.
Well, I hope not too. It's pretty safe to say you have serious conservative credentials. And the reason I emphasize that is because the topic I want to focus on today is, guess what? Donald Trump, his big bill, and what the heck happened there.
Yeah.
Um, so you just published an essay, which I heartily recommend to everybody who's hearing this. Go to Dispatch and look for Riedel's tax bill highlights the collapse of GOP policymaking. Zounds, that is not exactly a soft sock in the kisser. That's a very strong statement. Why did you write that essay?
Out of exasperation. I have worked in conservative policy circles for 25 years in Washington, and before that, several years in Wisconsin. And I consider myself a free market, traditional economic conservative. I want less spending, less government, but also less budget deficits. I want free trade. I want more free market policies. And I'm seeing a Republican Party that has abandoned, especially caring about the budget deficit. Now, obviously, Republicans being hypocrites on the budget deficit is nothing new. I was around for the '01 tax cuts. I was around for the 2017 tax cuts. But this bill is on a whole other level, $5 trillion over the decade. And it was done with no policy process at all on the Hill. And as someone who used to work on the Hill and someone who has advised Republican lawmakers for 25 years, I wrote it out of exasperation, not just that they're abandoning their principles, but there was no actual policy process happening whatsoever. They were essentially doing whatever Donald Trump told them to do. And so I wanted, after spending a year diving into the policies, I wanted to step back and show people what was really happening.
That's a load. Wow. Um, so the tax, give us a sketch of the tax breaks that are handed out. My understanding is there are a few that relate to production, but the vast majority of them are simple tax reductions. I'd like you to sketch your view of the difference between those two.
Well, I mean, I think the way that I break down the tax bill is for about $3.5 trillion over 10 years, they extend the 2017 tax cuts. Um, it's a very expensive extension. There are certain policies I would have extended, absolutely. I think some of the ability of businesses to immediately deduct investments, to immediately deduct R&D are good things. Also, I think some of the individual changes that raise the standard deduction are good. But my preference was to offset the $3 trillion dollars with other policies to perhaps raise other revenues, perhaps scaling back the 20% small business tax deduction. Instead, Republicans stuffed it with $2 trillion dollars more in giveaways that don't do much for the economy. And I'm talking about no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, a big handout to seniors, a $60 billion handout to farmers, the salt deduction, which I know is a very polarizing issue. But as an economist, that was almost $1 trillion. They put in all these bailouts and giveaways that don't help the economy, but pushed the cost up to $5 trillion. And that's why experts on the right and left who have modeled this bill don't show any long-term increase in economic growth.
Well, let's just stop it at that point because here's one of the things I try to do on this podcast, and that is to raise the level of understanding that we all have so that ordinary voters can make judgments about things
Mhm.
like does it even make sense that this particular bill is going to fill in the blank,
Right.
further stimulate the economy, help build growth, or really just will have no effect other than an expense that the government will have to pay. Can you walk us into how you think about that issue?
Yes, I mean the way to grow the economy long term is to recognize first that economic growth, mathematically speaking, is the product of a bigger labor supply, more workers, and more productivity per worker. So if you want to make the economy bigger, you either have to have more workers or more hours, and you have to make workers more
Or both?
productive. That means that policies that scale back immigration, that reduces the labor supply, that makes the economy smaller. Policies that reduce productivity make the economy smaller. I like certain policies that increase productivity, that help businesses expand, that give people more education, give people more tools, give more incentives for businesses to grow. That grows productivity. What does not help the economy is just giveaways. And I know that there is a social argument for giveaways. There are social arguments for giveaways to certain groups that need it, and I don't argue with that. But from an economic standpoint, cash transfers don't actually grow the economy unless they either incentivize more work or increase productivity of workers. And when I look at this bill, I see a lot of giveaways to groups that politicians want to help, which again is great for the recipients, but that's not going to give us the economic growth we want. For that, you either need more workers or more productivity.
Donald Trump's quote, which it was so terse and it was so brilliant, and I remembered it was, "It's a beautiful bill. It has something for everyone."
That is the attitude that gave us $30 trillion dollars of debt. Politicians see themselves more as Santa Claus instead of asking themselves, how can I help the economy prosper and raise wages and create jobs? It becomes, what interest groups do I need to buy off? What voter groups do I need to buy off? And oh, by the way, what member of Congress is holding out their vote until I give some kickback to their voters or their special interest? That's the attitude that gives us $30 trillion in debt.
This particular bill had a history that startled me, and that was it started off in the House of Representatives, which has a very strident Trump MAGA caucus, and came out of the House of Representatives, and many commentators said, "Man, this bill is really MAGA," and it's going to go to the Senate. The Senate will be the place where it will cool down. Cooler heads will prevail. It is, after all, the Senate. It's a bit sleepier. And it came out of the Senate and was dramatically changed. That's true. But it really took me by surprise. Can you sketch what the heck happened?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm old enough to remember when the Senate was the bipartisan moderating force to the wild, wild west of the House of Representatives. In this case, however, the House did what you expect it to do. It drafted a MAGA bill, and when it got over to the Senate made the farm bailout even bigger. They made some of the handouts even bigger. They scaled back some of the offsets and savings. You had people like Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, trying to say the cost wasn't big enough. And so it was really interesting that the moderating force lost its moderating ability, and part of that is that's part of reconciliation. The difference with a reconciliation bill is you don't need 60 votes. And so you really just have to convince the majority party. You don't need to build bipartisan bridges. And the bill got worse in the Senate and the cost went up. And I remember certain Republican senators saying, I'm never going to vote for this at its cost. Ron Johnson from my home state of Wisconsin, we're going to scale back the cost. It was all bluster because at the end of the day, almost no Republicans would actually cast a deciding vote to kill one of Donald Trump's priorities because it would be political suicide. And that means all of their concerns at the end of the day are just bluster because they're going to vote how they're told.
There was a feature of the bill that came up before the final vote that just blew my mind. And that was that if you look at the bill and you look for things that are true incentives, improvements in the tax structure on
Yeah.
businesses that would actually have some incentive for businesses to produce more, it was capped at 2029. And I looked at that and just said, where the heck did that come from?
Yeah, this was in the House version that first came out was they took policies, the actual few growth policies, and they capped those at 5 years. This was, helping businesses deduct the cost of new investments, helping businesses deduct the cost of research and development. And that's why even the Tax Foundation, which is a conservative pro-tax cut modeling group here in Washington, D.C., came out and said this bill is actually going to shrink the long-term economy because the only parts that were good were the parts that were capped, and a lot of the most destructive parts were extended. They did end up making the business provisions longer term in the Senate version, which of course made the cost higher. I would have preferred offsetting that elsewhere. I think, again, there was a lot of places where they could have cut the cost of this bill, and there were no budget constraints whatsoever during the process.
So the question that occurred to me is if it just doesn't make sense for any reason, the only reason I could think of to include that would be to pretend that the overall cost of the bill is
Yeah.
lower than it actually is because you pretend that it will go away in a few years and there'll be no attempt to revive it and make it permanent, blah, blah, blah. That's all I could see happening.
That was one of the most infuriating parts of the bill was the scoring. What they said was extending the tax cuts doesn't count because the expiration dates we put in 2017, everybody knows they were fake. And so extending the tax cuts is free because no one took those expiration dates seriously. However, we're going to put new expiration dates for 2029, and we want credit for those, and we want to take credit for keeping the cost down, even though we just said all of our past expiration dates were fake and don't count. So they weren't even ideologically consistent. They wanted to get rid of the past expiration dates but get credit for the new ones just to keep the cost down. And one of the most infuriating angles is when the Congressional Budget Office actually scored the bill with the Joint Committee on Taxation and showed how much it'll cost. Republicans then went to war with the scorekeepers. They went to war with the referees. They said that CBO was lying. I had an op-ed in the Washington Post exposing the absurdity of attacking the scorekeepers who actually did a really good job on this bill and had done a very good job on past tax scoring because CBO wouldn't go along with these gimmicky numbers. It was really, it was this is a lot of the stuff that really upset me. It wasn't just bad policy, but they were selling it so dishonestly.
At this point, I'd like to transition into a specific discussion of debt overall. And let me just start with the dumbest question I could possibly come up with, which and I'm very good at that. Um, why why is there a debt problem? Let's say we increase the debt and it's much bigger than it was before. We're going to hit, $60 trillion of national debt. What's the problem there? If we've always been able to pay the debt. What's the big deal? And if the tax cuts we pass are contributing to that, well, that's the way you get the tax cut. Just expand the debt. What's the problem?
Modest levels of debt are fine for a household and fine for a government. Um, you know, During World War II, we went to 100% of GDP in debt to fight World War II. But then from the end of World War II to 2008, it was about 40% of GDP. That was sustainable. It has since gone back up to 100% of GDP and is headed to as high as 250 to 300% of GDP over the next 30 years. So what? What does that mean? The first aspect is it's going to make the economy grow slower because if the government has to borrow $200 trillion over the next 30 years, which is terrifying when you think about it, that's $200 trillion of savings that aren't available for families to borrow for home loans, for businesses to borrow for business loans, for car loans. So the economy loses investment. The investment that grows the economy is gone because the government is soaking up all the savings to pay for itself. The Congressional Budget Office estimated recently that the debt could swallow a third to a half of all family income growth over the next 30 years. That's problem one. Problem two is the interest cost for the federal government. In the past 3 years, interest costs have tripled. They have now surpassed Medicaid, Defense, and Medicare to become the second largest item in the budget after Social Security. And in the next 15 years, they're going to pass Social Security. That means that a decade from now, a third of your federal income taxes, I'm sorry, a third of all your federal taxes, everything you pay through April, is just going to pay the interest on the debt. 30 years from now, 70% of all your taxes are just going to pay interest on the debt. In that situation, you either have to drastically raise taxes or drastically cut other programs because all of the money is going to pay interest. Because ultimately, we can't borrow forever. There's only so much money for the government to borrow. And so that's the threat of this debt. There's less investment, which means less growth, and also the money that you want government to spend on education, childcare, the environment, or if you're conservative, defense and tax cuts. That no, you're going to be paying interest to bondholders when you send money to Washington.
Well, it's a lovely picture. What's the pro? What's the what? I don't know. Where are we headed in this thing? Let me push the envelope even into stranger territory. There's rhetoric about what a debt crisis could be provoked. And
Mhm.
I have yet to hear the media give any clear explanation of what a debt crisis is, how it's different from the normal situation, and what we could be facing. The word is scary, so
Yeah.
commentators use it, but there's no explanation of debt crisis.
Mhm.
So you've talked about the debt being paid off and how big that would be and what the effect of that is. But a crisis is something different. What's a
Yeah.
debt crisis?
Well, first, let me put another point on how bad the future outlook is. A couple of years ago, the economists at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania tried to model out the long-term economy under current debt projections. Their models crashed. They could not even project a functioning economy 30 years from now under current debt. So, what does that look like? A debt crisis would likely occur inside the bond market. What that means is that, again, we're on pace to borrow $200 trillion over the next 30 years for the federal government. The bond market that takes our savings and lends it to Washington, or we would prefer lends it to businesses and homeowners, is going to get stretched. It's not going to be able to lend money fast enough to Washington to feed Washington's insatiable appetite. When that happens, there becomes a shortage and interest rates rise because interest rates essentially are the price of money. It's the price of borrowing. And when demand goes up, the price goes up. So what happens is at a certain point, the bond markets get stretched, interest rates start to dramatically rise. And the problem is when interest rates rise, that just means the federal government has to borrow more money to pay the interest costs, which in turn raises interest rates even more in what is called a debt spiral. And when you have a debt spiral, interest costs, interest rates, interest costs, interest rates feeding on each other, that's when costs can soar. And that's essentially the bond market's way of telling the government, we're cutting you off. In that situation, when they cut the government off, they can't supply the funding. Government has two choices. It can either make fiscal consolidations, raise taxes, cut spending, cut deficits, or it can just run the printing press. And Donald Trump is already stating a preference for running the printing press. That's essentially why he's threatening the Federal Reserve Chairman right now, Jerome Powell, because these effects are already beginning and he just wants to run the printing press. It's not necessarily true that a debt crisis will happen with one cataclysmic day where everything collapses. You can have mini debt crises where there's a small panic and the government does some printing or some deficit cutting, but it's not enough, so you have to do more and more. And it builds over 20 to 30 years. And at the end of the day, you're still in a pretty bad spot.
Let me see if I have an understanding of how I think the debt issuance process works on a daily level,
Mhm.
and uh, I want to test that with you to see if I'm correct because it's helped me to understand some of the theories more. The government decides we need another $100 billion. And it issues $100 billion in treasuries, bills, notes, what have you. Issues those bills and says to the market, what do you pay me for the bills? Now, a bill, when I buy it, is a treasury note. Let's call it a treasury note that says on certain date, I will pay you, the holder of the note, $100. The way it works is people bid for that $100 billion. How much will you pay me for the promise that 1 year from now I will give you $100 billion? Will you give me? Will you give me $90 billion? Dollars? Will you give me $80 billion? Dollars? So that establishes the interest rate on the loan. If you give me $99 billion dollars for a $100 billion issuance, what is it? It's about a 1% interest rate. If you refuse to buy it, if you only buy it when it hits $80, if you offer $80 for a $100 bill, then you're up to 20% interest rates. And that's the actual economic mechanism by which the interest rates are established. Am I off on that?
Yeah, no, you are correct. It's done as an auction. Exactly. So if we're borrowing
Thank you.
$100 billion, if Washington needs to borrow $100 billion, people come, well, organizations, state and local governments, bond traders on behalf of them bid for who will accept the lowest interest rate in order to lend Washington the money. So one person might say, I'll lend Washington $100 billion for a 6% interest rate, and someone else says, well, I'll do it. I only need a 4% interest rate. And someone else says, I'll accept it for only a 2% interest rate. And whoever offers the lowest interest rate gets is the one who wins the auction and lends the money. The danger we have right now with these auctions is that the Congressional Budget Office projects that the average interest rate on the debt will never again rise above 3.5%. They project out 30 years. They say even with the debt going so high, they say the interest rate, don't worry, the interest rate will never exceed 3.5%. Well, in the last 6 months, most of the bond auctions have landed at about 4.5%. So we're already having interest rates higher than the highest level projected over the next 30 years because the people lending money to the government aren't willing to lend money to the government at a 3.5% interest rate. They will not accept less than 4.5%. And if that keeps going up, every point that interest rates go up costs about $3 trillion over the decade and $40 trillion over 3 decades. That's per point. So that difference between 3.5 and 4.5, $3 trillion over the decade, 45 trillion over 3 decades, which is like the cost of a second Defense Department. That is why anyone with a student loan can tell you that when you owe a lot of money, even small changes in interest rates can bury you. That's the danger we have right now.
All right. Thanks for walking us through that. Let's go back to the Republican arguments. I hear two basic arguments. First, Donald Trump's "It's a beautiful bill, everybody gets money," which is look at all the money we're giving you. That's the first argument. It's very
Yeah.
subtle, very hard to understand. It's very sophisticated argument. The second argument is the cuts will pay for themselves. The cuts will grow the economy. And when we have a growing economy, we will have increased government taxes on the economy without raising the corporate rate. And it will grow so much that it will pay for the tax cuts. So you get a wonderful tax cut, great, and it's free.
It is
Where do we go with that argument?
the idea that tax cuts will pay for themselves has gone from a theoretical construct of the Laffer curve, which says that there is a certain point at which, whether it's 70% or 80%, revenues are maximized. And if you raise rates higher, people will stop working, saving, investing, revenues will fall.
So
They've
it
turned that
crests.
concept into all tax cuts always pay for themselves, no matter what the rate is, which is absurd. The Reagan tax cuts did not pay for themselves. The Bush tax cuts did not pay for themselves. The Trump tax cuts did not pay for themselves. The current tax cuts really can't pay for themselves because most of the cost is just continuing the current rates. So it's not giving the economy new tax pro-growth policies. And the parts that are new, like I said, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, SALT deductions, bailouts for seniors and farmers. Those are not policies that dramatically increase labor supply or productivity. And so there's no way this policy can pay for itself. Here's a rule of thumb to think about. Most Americans pay a marginal tax rate of about 20% to Washington at their current income. If you're paying about a 20% tax rate, every dollar of tax cuts or new spending needs to create $5 in new economic growth in order to pay for itself. Because what it means is if I get a dollar of tax cuts, I need to create $5 worth of income that would then be taxed at 20% to give the government back its dollar. The number of federal policies that can increase economic growth at a 500% return on investment is infinitesimal. $5, I mean, you might get a little bit of economic growth, you might get a little bit of higher income. You're not going to get a 5-to-1 return needed to pay for itself. That's just an empty talking point.
So the I'm glad we got into discussing the Laffer curve because it really is something that's been on my mind since Joe Biden's administration, and during Biden's administration, I began to hear advocates within the I don't recall Biden saying this, but I recall advocates saying this that the spending they were engaging in would stimulate the economy so much that the spending would pay for itself. So I was sitting there saying, wait a minute, am I hearing an MAGA conservative preach the Laffer curve?
Yeah.
Does Joe Biden have a reverse Laffer curve? Do we have a situation in which we have two political parties, one of which says tax cuts pay for themselves, and one of which says spending pays for itself. And that's what we're stuck with as a political choice. How does that
Yeah.
feel to you?
Yeah. I mean, again, that's how you end up $30 trillion in debt, is because both parties sell their voters a free lunch. Republicans have said for 45 years tax cuts will pay for themselves. They've never paid for themselves, at least not at the current tax rates we have, not even close. And Democrats have more aggressively said, kind of based on a Keynesian, we're going to put money in the economy and that will pay for itself. That doesn't work either. Which is not to say that smart policies can't create some positive economic feedback. Sure. But again, a 5-to-1 return is almost impossible to achieve. And really, this is it's just backwards reasoning. And the reality is most politicians know their stuff is not going to pay for themselves, but they need to have a talking point when they're accused of blowing up the deficit. So they just say whatever talking point what will answer it. It was absurd when Republicans were attacking the CBO for saying these tax cuts won't pay for themselves. Tim Scott, a Republican senator from South Carolina, put out a video saying tax cuts have always paid for themselves and CBO always gets it wrong. He said CBO got it wrong with the 1930s tax cuts and they got it wrong with the 1960s tax cuts. The little fun fact, the CBO did not exist until 1974. There was, and additionally, there were no 1930s tax cuts. He's thinking of the 1920s Mellon tax cuts. But the idea that the CBO missed these tax cuts paying for themselves would be a remarkable achievement considering CBO did not even exist until decades later. These are the intellectual backflips that lawmakers engage in to try to argue that their stuff will pay for themselves.
Yeah, I loved that quote. It really, really got me going too. Um, let me bring our conversation to someone who hopefully is a bit more serious than Senator Scott on that. Um, Bill Galston wrote a column that intrigued me and disturbed me, and I didn't know how to deal with it. He argued that we should shift our concern from ending deficits and shift our concern to a stable debt to GDP ratio, kind of a common sense argument.
Yeah.
If your GDP does increase, you have the capacity to increase, to pay additional interest on debt. Therefore, it's not as harmful as a situation where the GDP does not grow as fast as your debt grows. Nonetheless, it concerned me. What's your thought on Galston's suggestion?
I agree with Bill for two reasons. First, we can't balance the budget. Part of my job, I'm a federal budget modeler. I'm a federal budget economist. A year ago, I put out a 30-year budget for the federal government to stabilize the debt. The level of changes you would have to make to balance the budget are virtually impossible. In fact, now because of these tax cuts now, even stabilizing the debt at 100% of GDP would require about $11 trillion in tax cuts and tax hikes and spending cuts over the decade. That's just to stabilize the debt. I think we're going to have a hard enough time doing that. I don't think we can get to balance. But the other point I would make is I don't think we necessarily have to balance the budget. I agree that, like a family, if your income is rising, you can afford to have more mortgage debt. I think right now, I mentioned earlier, we've gone from a debt of 40% of GDP to 100% of GDP. It's headed to 300% over the next couple of decades. If we could just keep the debt at 100% of GDP, we could avoid a debt crisis. And at 100% of GDP, let's say interest rates stabilize at 4%. Well, if the debt's 100% of GDP and interest rates are 4%, you're stabilizing the interest costs at about 4% of GDP out of a budget that collects about 18% of GDP in revenue. So around 20% of your revenues are going to interest. Not great, but it's not fatal. If you balance the budget, the debt as a share of the economy would actually start falling, which is nice, but I don't think it's required. And so if your goal is to stabilize the debt as a share of GDP, that means getting the deficits to about 3% of GDP per year compared to the 8% of GDP they're heading towards in a decade and the 14% of GDP they're headed towards in 3 decades. If we could stabilize at 3, that would be great. And by stabilize at 3, I guess that means to me is maybe going 1 to 2% of GDP during a boom and allowing it to go to 4 to 5% of GDP during a recession. That that if we can get there, I'll be happy. It's going to be a very uphill battle.
So, one of the things I was wondering is looking at the Trump bill and going through the incentives to increase business activity and how few and far between they were, and with a, I presume, fictitious cutoff date, but it's there nonetheless. How does this bill deal with the middle class and the rhetoric and the concern that we need to rebuild the American middle class?
Well, I mean, I think the Trump bill, I mean, most of the dollar tax cuts go to high earners, obviously. We saw that in 2017. We're seeing it now. Most of the benefits go to those who are higher earners. But middle and lower earners do get a significant amount of tax cuts as well. They get an extension of things like the higher standard deduction, the lower rates that we saw in the TCJA, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on car loans. I think those are geared towards the middle class. The upper middle class and higher earners benefit more from the SALT state and local tax deduction giveaway. My concern with this approach is I don't think rebuilding the middle class is about giving them no tax on tips. I don't think
Mhm.
rebuilding the middle class is about throwing a couple $100s at tax cuts. I think rebuilding the middle class is about first and foremost rebuilding the economy. And we don't see a lot of pro-growth policies in the bill to rebuild the economy. And on top of it, we see other policies such as tariffs that are going to cost middle class families probably more than whatever they're saving in tax cuts. We're seeing immigration restrictions that are going to push up costs for a lot of other Americans. They're going to push up a lot of costs where there's going to be labor shortage. I don't think rebuilding the middle class is about pursuing bad economic policies that bring stagnant economic growth, but throwing a couple $100s more in tax cuts in order to offset some of it. I would rather focus on growth without blowing up the deficit and stagnating the economy.
And my read of what the middle class really wants, and I think it is confirmed by the little polling that discusses this, stable, reliable, long-term prosperity is what middle class Americans see as needed for them and for their kids. And freebies just passed out by one party or another. Well, nobody's going to turn that stuff down, but it just isn't what really builds itself into how your family conducts its life.
Yeah, and if you talk to people, they will say, I don't want more government aid. I want a better job. I want higher incomes. I want low interest rates, less inflation. That will benefit my family long term more than a check, a couple $100 check from the government that might come next year and might not. But I mean, this is the politics of pandering. This is where we're at right now, where politicians see the economy more as a messaging challenge than an economic challenge. We saw this under President Biden when he pursued policies that were inflationary, and then they saw that more as instead of changing the policies, they saw this as a messaging problem. We're going to try to spin the inflation. President Trump is doing a lot of the same thing. We're pursuing tariffs that's going to cost families. We're pursuing immigration restrictions that is going to have, some economic challenges. We're pushing up the debt, but we're just going to spin our way out of this. We're going to talking point our way out of this. Well, eventually, families can't eat talking points. They need to eat higher wages and more jobs. And I just think it's pandering instead of showing real economic stewardship. And that's part of the reason the economy really hasn't been very good for the last 15, 20 years. We get excited about 2 to 3% economic growth as a ceiling because that's not where politicians have put their focus.
I think back to well, I guess I'm at the age when I can think back to a whole bunch of prior presidencies, and in my lifetime, good Lord, um, Roosevelt. I mean, think about the growth that occurred and what happened to the American middle class. The Roosevelt administration, 1933 to 1944. Harry Truman brings it up to 1952. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, a conservative, but with stable economic measures, brings it up to 1960, and Kennedy Johnson to 1968, where Johnson plunged the nation into an inflationary situation that has changed our politics entirely. But lumped together, that was an era in which the growth of the economy was astonishing, and the middle class participated directly in that growth. Um, we have seen nothing like that again, and our politics suffers from it, and the American polity suffers from it.
That is one of the, if not the biggest economic challenge of our time, because if the economy is not growing, the effects downstream are everywhere. The deficit gets bigger, the debt gets bigger, demands for more government aid get bigger. The difference between 2% and 3% economic growth, or 3% versus 4% economic growth, compounded over decades, at the end of that period is tens of thousands of dollars per household. And we've become satisfied with slower economic growth. We may not get the full growth we've had back in that era because, returning to what I said earlier, economic growth is a function of labor supply and productivity. We did have the advantage in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of the labor supply soared due to more women entering the workforce and the baby boomers entering the workforce. And now labor supply is the baby boomers leaving the workforce, low fertility, and major immigration restrictions that are going to limit the growth of the workforce to zero within a decade. CBO believes that starting a decade from now, the population might actually start to turn negative. That for the economy is devastating. It means zero labor supply growth. That means you can only get productivity growth. We did have strong productivity growth in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, or early 70s. Coming out of World War II, there was a burst of inventions, a burst of innovation. In the last 50 years, productivity has slowed too, and that's what's vexed economists, is if we're going to have the labor supply dropping, we need to supercharge productivity. And productivity growth has been so slow. We had a little boomlet from about 96 to '05 with computing and internet technology, and then we're back to very slow productivity. And I would love to see politicians focus on how do we expand the labor supply? How do we rebuild productivity? And how do we get closer to that growth of an earlier era rather than, again, just handing out the last remaining crumbs of a stagnant economy to voters?
Well, that would be a transformation devoutly to be desired. And have two political parties. Here's the other thing that I would throw into that is uh, I'm a Democrat. I talk to other Democrats, and conversations revolve around, oh my gosh, how are we going to elect Democrats because they'll do everything right? And I'm looking back to the Biden administration. You know, I caution them about the mistakes of the Biden administration, and they look at me funny. Um, the point I'm leading up to is this: when I listed the presidents during the foremost era of a major American growth and the building of the American middle class, it wasn't a Democratic list. It had a lot of
Hmm.
Democrats in it, but it had Republicans as well.
Yeah.
So what was going on there was a national consensus on issues and the kinds of issues you've outlined. If only one party adopted them and bashed the other party over the head for not adopting them, it might have some benefit. There might be some victories in which the good side would win. But that's not what we really need. We need ultimately a national consensus in which it doesn't fundamentally matter whether a Republican or a Democrat is elected because we all agree something. Um, Now, I know in part I hearken to that because my youth was spent in an era where some of that was happening, and it's
Yeah.
very far and gone away. Nonetheless,
Hmm.
I remain hopeful that if we listen to the middle class in particular and what the middle class wants, that sure sounds like what middle class families would like. The ability to know from year to year they and their kids would have a successful government and a successful economy supporting them. And their role, work hard, do good, build a family.
Yeah, I think that there's a forgotten silent majority here that I think is more moderate They're focused on kitchen table issues. They want to bring down the cost of college education, the cost of healthcare. They want to keep the tax burden limited. They don't want to go into huge debt. They don't necessarily want handouts. But right now, politics has been captured by, I think, the far left and the MAGA right, who frankly doesn't really always care as much about economic policy. Economic policy is kind of one part of the culture war to them. And I see this more on the right because I've made a career working on the right. The lawmakers I talked to didn't get elected on growing the economy. They got elected on supporting Trump, on retribution, revenge, mass deportations, and they're just not, economic growth is not their focus. The economy that to them is something you spin. It's not something you solve, it's something you spin. You say, well, the other guy would have been worse, and my policies are all going to pay for themselves. And sure, none of these predictions are going to turn out to be true, but I'm going to have a great excuse to bash the other side a year from now when that happens. And this is why both parties are so unpopular right now. This is why both parties are disliked. They're both catering to extremes. I think Democrats are more focused on the economy than Republicans right now. But I do think Democrats, I think under Biden, there was a bit of a capture by more of a progressive left than a lot of voters thought they were getting when they voted for Joe Biden. I think a more centrist president probably would have been stronger against inflation and stronger against deficits. But really, both sides, they don't see how that they get elected that way, and this forgotten middle of voters, are the ones who are just exasperated by both sides.
Couldn't agree more. It's difficult hearing you talk because it sounds so much like myself.
Great
Um,
minds think alike.
oh yeah. Thanks so much for spending time with me. I appreciate it a great deal. To folks who are listening, check out the Dispatch and Jessica Riedl's new piece on the bill. It is an excellent dissection, and she continues to publish on a regular basis ideas that we need all to understand. Um, and there's no reason why the Democratic Party cannot embrace the vast majority of the things you are talking about. And there's no reason why the Republican Party could not simultaneously embrace the vast majority of things and then differentiate themselves on some darn thing they'll go out and figure out. If they want to disagree, they'll figure out a way to disagree. But what would be wonderful is to move away from an era in which economics is on the back burner and put it back on the front burner where it belongs. Thanks for joining me today.